Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Stench of Truth on Blog Talk Radio. Some of you may know me from my YouTube channel, Tenebrous T, T-E-N-E-B-R-O-U-S-T, Tenebrous T at YouTube. I'll watch my videos over there. My show is also called The Stench of Truth on YouTube. Anyway, we do two different things. The YouTube channel is meant for politics and the economy and other, shall I say, more down-to-earth issues. Not that this radio show does not touch on very down-to-earth topics, but more of an esoteric angle to what we discuss here on Blog Talk Radio, The Stench of Truth. My name is Ted Torbich, and I'll be your host this evening, like I am always. Once again, I would like to direct you to my YouTube channel, Tenebrous T, or you can search The Stench of Truth on YouTube, and you'll be able to find me there. I've received a lot of feedback in preparation for this week's guest, Christopher Knowles. And for those of you who do not know who Christopher Knowles is, I am going to read a short biography of Christopher Knowles from Amazon.com. He has written a couple of books that have received high praise in various quarters. So let me just read this short biography, and then I will also go into a little bit of other details about him. And then hopefully we'll get on to the actual discussion. Christopher Knowles is the author of the newly published The Secret History of Rock and Roll, The Mysterious Roots of Modern Music, Viva editions. He is also the author of the Eagle Award-winning Our Gods Wear Spandex, The Secret History of Comic Book Heroes by Redwheel Weiser, and the critically acclaimed Clash City Showdown, The Music, the Meaning, and the Legacy of the Clash by Page Free Publications. He's co-author of the complete X-Files Behind the Series, The Myths, and the Movies by Insight Editions, the authorized companion to the long-running TV series. Christopher was a longtime associate editor and contributing writer for the 5-time Eisner Award-winning magazine Comic Book Artist, and has contributed feature articles to magazines like Comic Book Marketplace and the popular industry website Comic Book Resources. Christopher has also written features, columns, and reviews for Classic Rock, one of the top music magazines from the UK. His Jimmy Page cover story was featured in the best-selling issue in that magazine's history. Christopher has appeared at the New York Comic-Con and lectured on pop culture and mythology at the Center for Theory and Research at the legendary Esalen Institute in Big Sur in 2008 and 2009. Christopher has appeared in the documentaries Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics, MVD Visual, Wonder Woman, Daughter of Myth by Warner Brothers, and The Man, the Myth, Superman by Warner Brothers. Christopher has appeared on the popular ABC News magazine 2020, as well as numerous podcasts and radio talk shows on NPR, Voice of America, and various commercial stations. He lives in New Jersey with his wife and family. He is perhaps more widely known for his blog, secretsun.blogspot.com, and for his work in illustrating and illuminating the ways that the mystery religions and esoteric teachings have made their way into modern pop culture, music, and movies. Of course, the Secret Sun, for any who's not aware, is of course Sirius, and perhaps we will talk about the significance of that today. But I am not going to hold off any longer. I have my guest on the line, and I'm going to bring him up right now, and we're going to get right into the discussion, and I'm sure it's going to be a good one. But before I do that, I just want to say that I'm very pleased to have Mr. Knowles on the show today, and I'm very thankful that he agreed to come on and discuss some of the esoteric topics we're going to discuss. And I can't more highly recommend thesecretsun.blogspot.com. It's an excellent source of material, and it is a very, very enjoyable read. And Chris knows his stuff, so let's get him on the line and get to talking. Chris, are you there?
Yeah, and apparently your cat is too.
Yeah, she's right here. She has a way of showing up right when I'm ready to go online, and it's
Nothing
almost
wrong
like
with that.
Hey, she's a star. She's in some of my videos on YouTube. She shows up. She knows what's going on.
She's in the know.
Yes. Well, anyway, hey, I'm really glad you joined us today, and
All right.
As per what we discussed previously, we were going to. Oh, and thanks for the plug on the Blogspot too. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Hopefully, you'll bring in a lot of your fans. I've already received a lot of positive feedback for your being on the show this week, and I'm sure that we're going to have a great discussion.
Super.
Yeah. So, since we're going to be talking about Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek, and as you put it, Astrognosticism, which is great. The 9, Barack Obama, and the Project Bluebeam hoax. Let's get right into Gene Roddenberry and how Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry both were influenced by the 9, and maybe you could also tell people a little bit about the 9 as a background for those who are not aware of that story.
Well, I'm not sure how influenced he was himself. I think that it could have been a lot of it the other way around. If you watch old Star Trek episodes, there's a lot of I hesitate to use the word meme, but there are a lot of these themes that the 9 were sort of trying to put forward that had already been explored in the context of the original Star Trek series. On the blog, I put a clip from the Return to Tomorrow episode, which is where Kirk is channeling, this ancient god Sargon. And there's a lot of, in the original pitch that Gene Roddenberry had sent to NBC, there was a lot about, disembodied alien intelligences that were using people as channels and stuff. So Roddenberry had already been exploring this stuff in the series itself. There's a lot of, the episode Who Mourns for Adonai, which is, pretty classical alien astronaut intervention theory stuff, well before Chariots of the Gods was published.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
yes.
There's a lot of Gnostic themes. The apple, which is obviously an Eden allegory. Return of the Archons. There's so much in the series itself that was just so laden with esoteric thought. I mean, just the first 2 pilots themselves, and we're talking about, the Cage, and then When No Man Has Gone Before. I mean, basically, this whole idea of going out into space to find the gods, not waiting for them anymore, not waiting for them to show up, sort of going out and looking for them. And that's so much what you see in Star Trek, where, the crew is encountering godlike beings, godlike races like the Telosians and whatnot. So I think that it was sort of a match made in heaven, I guess. The 9 is such a confusing and bizarre and convoluted phenomenon. It's so hard to separate truth from disinformation, from all the different things that were going on in that whole time period. I mean, it seems to me that there were 2 separate agendas going on, that there was an agenda that was for the initiates, as it were, and then there was the public face of it, which was very New Age, almost doctrinaire kind of New Age thought that they were putting forth in the books, such as Briefing for the Landing on Planet Earth. And that's, one of the things we have to remember is that their whole pitch was that there was going to be this mass alien landing. I guess it was maybe 1977 or 78, and they were preparing everyone for this. And of course, there was all sorts of unsavory characters and spooks and corporate malcontents and miscreants, and then of course the very strange and contradictory figure of Andrija Puharich.
Absolutely, yes.
Who was sort of a walking contradiction himself. So I'm not exactly sure that Roddenberry was necessarily influenced by them in one way, but the way he was influenced directly was in his 1975 or 76 script that later formed the basis of the Project Bluebeam hoax. So ironically, his take on this whole phenomenon was as we see in what is called the God Thing screenplay that he had written for Paramount, is very skeptical and suspicious of just this whole idea of space gods and channeling and all this kind of stuff, because all these sort of ideas that the Nine were fooling around with in their work, he had put in the context of the God Thing in a very unfavorable light. So that, and ironically, for Roddenberry himself, not necessarily the whole Star Trek phenomenon, but for Roddenberry himself, the Nine had a very, negative influence on him, you would say. And ironically, the fact that, people still talk about Bluebeam today, I never, ever thought it was a real program. Not to say that there aren't aspects of it that could be, but it was, pretty obvious to me, given who was putting, this whole idea forward, a radical fundamentalist character. I don't believe anything those people say about anything, so I'm naturally going to be skeptical of that. And when I actually sat down and reread the whole Bluebeam essay, it just was so screamingly obvious that it was just filled with plot points lifted from various Star Trek screenplays.
Well, of course, for people who are not aware, the Project Bluebeam idea is one that the government or elements within the government have as a program, this Bluebeam program, which would be used to simulate an alien landing and or abduction or invasion scenario using holograms and various other high technological means in order to fool people, appearing as either Jesus or Buddha or whatever
Muhammad,
your God of choice is,
on,
that sort of thing, in the clouds, come back to save their people or whatever, to cause people to lay their arms down on the battlefield or whatever, being used as a technological dream machine by the powers that be, so to speak. So I have to tell you that for a time I did believe that Bluebeam was a real project, or at least that it was possible. And I would still say that, like you, elements of it are certainly possible.
Yes.
But why don't you tell us how Bluebeam actually came about and who was really behind it?
Well, that's a matter of speculation. I do not believe that Serge Monast had written it himself. Serge Monast is the figure who is credited with the original circulation of what he said was a leak from some, some government employees or whatever, and I think it was fed to him. Knowing what I know about him, I don't see him being a real big Star Trek fan.
No,
doesn't seem like the type.
Yeah, not being a stuffy, far right-wing religious extremist. I would think that would not be something he would be too interested in. Yeah,
I think it was fed to him. And there's a lot of sort of winks and nods in the dossier, as it were, itself. Mentions about Mr. Spock and Star Trek is actually mentioned. But the whole idea, the basic idea of Bluebeam was straight out of the script that Roddenberry wrote after he had spent a lot of time up in Ossining, New York, with what was called Lab 9. And Lab 9 was run by Sir John Whitmore, who is a former race car driver and actually is like a motivational corporate speaker or something now. He's involved in some things. I've seen him pop up now and again on the internet. But that was, that whole idea of, I guess, using computers and sound waves and things like that to beam directly into people's consciousness, where they start to hear voices and believe they're being contacted by these religious figures. That was in Roddenberry's original screenplay, which let's just date it at 1976. So he's writing about this whole process, and then the next thing that's happening is, the holograms and, the spaceship showing up. Really all the sort of points that are regurgitated in Bluebeam are in this screenplay, The God Thing. So, but there are other elements too. There are other stories that are thrown in there too. There's actually the year that Monast had sort of announced that he had been leaked this dossier on Project Bluebeam. There was an episode called no, actually, let me just back up. There was an episode called Devil's Due, which was sort of taking a lot of these ideas from the God Thing, except for in this case it was a demon who was using holograms, was actually using some sort of machinery to induce earthquakes, and that's another aspect of Project Bluebeam, that there would be these artificial earthquakes that would convince people that the world was coming to an end. And that is straight out of this episode called Devil's Due. And the whole idea of an orbital platform with computers that are creating holograms that are inducing these seismic events and tremors and whatnot. So that was, I believe that was the year, it might have been a few years before, but in 1994, there were a couple books out. One was actually an unfavorable book written by a guy named Joe Engel, which really was the first book to really explore Roddenberry's involvement with Lab 9, but not where people first heard of it, and we'll get to that in a minute. But and then also Roddenberry's, I guess his official biography by David Alexander also came out. So these two books came out right around the same time that Bluebeam was published. And of course, both books explore what's called the God Thing, this Star Trek screenplay, which has all the basic talking points of Bluebeam. Let me just backtrack here a second. There's also the movie Star Trek V, which also had, that was the sort of the nadir of the series, as it were, the one that was directed by William Shatner and had the row your boat scene in it that just made the entire world cringe.
Oh yes.
Yeah, but that was also the idea that God had a spaceship, and the spaceship was malfunctioning and whatnot. And that was really the whole basis of the God Thing screenplay, that there was this ship that was sent out by some ancient race to civilize primitive worlds, and it civilized primitive worlds by creating all these illusions of mythology and religion that would give people sort of code of ethics and morals and whatnot. But it started to malfunction, and the crew of the Starship Enterprise had to deal with it and everything like that. But so that's really it's interesting, because the whole idea with the Nine was that they were these sort of, I guess, disembodied electronic intelligences and all this kind of thing. I mean, it sort of underwent a series of different evolutions, I guess. It sort of first became known when Puharich wrote a book about Uri Geller, and the appendices and the afterwards and such sort of talked about the Nine and his communications with these entities and everything like that. But there was a book called Gods of Aquarius, which was written by, actually I have it on my shelf here. But there was a book that was sort of one of the books on UFO cults in the 70s and such. I mean, it was basically a sympathetic telling, but it did have interview with both Puharich and Roddenberry. And then, of course, in 91, I believe it was, The Only Planet of Choice came out, which, well, I guess was the second major release that was written mainly by Phyllis Schlemmer, who was at that point had become the main channel for this group.
Yes, and I might point out that the Devil's Due, that one was a Next Generation episode, eventually, of the Star Trek Next Generation series.
Yeah, I believe that might have been in 91.
Yeah, and actually that has a lot of almost direct correlation with the entire Bluebeam idea, because the entity in that particular episode was in fact a hologram, and could appear wherever she or he, or however they manifested themselves, wherever she or he wanted to, and was able to trigger earthquakes and things of this nature.
Exactly.
So there was almost a direct correlation between the Bluebeam hypothesis and that particular episode of the Next Generation. In the original series, as you pointed out in a couple of episodes that you talked about, you can find several very similar storylines where, as you pointed out, like with Who Mourns for Adonai, and even Plato's Children.
Stepchildren, yeah.
It's Stepchildren, that's what it was, yeah. Plato's Stepchildren was another very good example of ancient intervention on Earth. And even parallel worlds idea come up several times. Before this was a theme in even really being talked about widely in quantum mechanics or physics circles. Even it was a little early for that sort of discussion, even though the idea had been laid down decades earlier for the possibility. But I think this kind of goes into your particular area of study a great deal, and that is how these particular themes appear within media, sort of as it's kind of like a throwback on one hand, but also a future projection on another. It's like it's bringing up something from the past, a mystical or esoteric idea from our past, but also it's a reflection on possible future events. It's almost like a circle in a way.
Yeah, I mean, this really ties into my basic theories of creativity and the creative mind, that there's an aspect of the creative mind that is not bound by Newtonian physics, that there is an aspect of ourselves, of our minds, that can step outside of that. And, the examples that I would point to would be obviously remote viewing, but also, a lot of these things that I catalog on the blog, where events in history are sort of prefigured in popular culture. A lot of the 9/11 stuff people are familiar with. But, there's a lot more besides. And I think that there is something, in our brains, or whatever is using our brains, for its own purposes, that can step outside causality, temporality, all these sort of things. That there's something that is beyond a reductionist view of reality.
Yeah, I can absolutely believe that. I would say that in some respects our consciousness goes beyond the reality that we can perceive physically or with our mechanical mind, and that perhaps we can catch glimpses of future events or past events and avoid causality in that regard. And that would be a way to explain why people can access certain powers and apparently do certain things when they shouldn't be able to, according to physical laws that we understand.
Well, it's funny because the whole idea of synchronicity, is something that I explore on the blog, and there's a lot of people who explore this on the internet. But in a lot of ways, I mean, synchronicity could be seen as being basically precognitive. That you think of something and it later manifests itself in a significant and meaningful way, not just you think of your grandmother and she calls, that whole classic coincidence idea. But I remember when I was at Esalen, ironically enough, we can get to that in a bit too. I was talking to a professor from Temple University. And I was explaining, various examples of synchronicity, and he said, that's not synchronicity. He said, that's precognition. And I guess we tend to, maybe it's a reductionist impulse in ourselves to say, well, this is all this is all synchronicity, this is all some strange glitch in the matrix, when it actually could be examples of psi. And I guess we've sort of been conditioned to resist that, but I think that's definitely something that needs to be explored.
I think so too. Synchronicity, and a lot of times for people who are not really looking out for it, it could happen to them quite frequently, and they have no knowledge of it whatsoever. But I think once you start to look into the esoteric and start to try to make sense of some of the symbolism and some of the things that we have and like you have with pop culture and music and movies and everything else, that you start to see this more and more because your eyes have been open to it. It may be like a self-perpetuating thing, perhaps, as I find that a lot of people who do research into these kind of topics typically have frequent synchronistic events in their lives.
Well, I was saying in a recent interview that it seems to play with you, that when you pay attention to it, it pays attention to you. So, what the exact mechanics of that are beyond, my reckoning, but it happened.
Yeah, we don't have any answers really. I mean, we really have no answers for bottom line issues when it comes to stuff like this. We're left to speculate for the most part. But really, like if someone were to ask you, well, what does this mean, or what does that mean? I mean, there are so many possibilities and so little. I mean, you've said before, when talking about the occult, that you can get buried in a morass of a lot of different things whenever you look at the occult in general and try to understand the mechanism that's being used there or being attempted to be used there, and ultimately, what are you left with at the end of the day? I mean, you're left with so much nonsense and garbage all mixed together with some possible truth that there's no way for you to understand exactly what's going on, and I don't think we really have answers to some of these more profound issues.
Well, maybe the answers, wouldn't be as fun. I
think
that,
well, that's I could believe that. I really could.
I think the human mind loves questions because I have this basic maxim that the only thing that makes life tolerable is feeling you have something to look forward to. So if your life is filled with interesting questions, you can always look forward to answering them. Once they're answered, it's basically a done deal. The cigarette has been extinguished, as it were. So I think that in a lot of ways, it seems to me that a lot of these mystical or occult or paranormal or all these sort of fields are almost engineered to not answer questions, because then it just becomes science. And science is profoundly boring. No matter how hard it's, people, a lot of these, the Carl Sagan types try to advocate for it. They've taken all the mystery and excitement out of science. The science that somebody like Isaac Newton or, these sort of late Enlightenment figures just sort of coming out of that whole alchemical understanding. It's not what they would understand as science, which is moving towards a holistic understanding of the mechanics of nature. It's basically, raping and killing and dismembering nature. Basically, is what science has become, and doing so, it's almost like a cartoon where somebody is covered with ants or rats and has been whittled down to the bone, and that's basically what science has done to nature, I think.
You couldn't have said it better, I think. And in fact, science, for the most part, in our society today, pits itself against such things like esotericism and wants to exalt itself as the answer and be all and end all to everything. And thus we have skeptics like James Randi and others who, would lord it over everybody that everything is a hoax and everything is, if it's not reducible or reproducible or, able to be experimentally controlled, then it has no validity and is not real. And science is too mechanistic in that regard. And I think you're bringing up Isaac Newton is a perfect example because, as you say, he did a lot of work with alchemy and with some other esoteric concepts, in addition to doing some very serious scientific work.
Well, again, it's this whole idea of a holistic understanding. Randy is not a scientist. He's an entertainer, and he's basically somebody who is a mouthpiece for interests who want, certain questions to go unasked. But the basic idea of, the skeptics and whatnot, let's say the big S, the capital S skeptics, because I do think that skepticism, small s, is extremely important in anything that you undergo. It's so easy to be credulous and to get sort of sucked into things, and that gets you nowhere either. But they're basically just egotists who want to assuage their immense feelings of self-loathing by finding other people to feel superior to. The interesting thing is that at the same time that the religious right was on the ascendancy in the 70s. The skeptics were more concerned with tea readers and palm readers and biofeedback and it was so obvious that they were being put out there to attack either things that were completely irrelevant or to attack what was becoming the New Age movement, and completely ignoring Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and all these people. Suspiciously so, and that's something. Now we have the rise of the atheists, and they're a lot more militant about taking on religion. But what we know is the skeptical establishment basically ignored religion, except for the most outlandish faith healers, and the most ridiculous, clownish faith healers who were, in fact, hurting the religious right movement by making it seem ridiculous, and so you really have to wonder. I would argue that it's because the same people were pulling the strings, the puppet strings on both movements, both the skeptical and the religious right. The same corporate interests were running behind the curtain on both accounts. But now we have the atheist movement, people like Hitchens and Dawkins and things like that. So the whole the complexion of the skepticism has changed. It really was a really ridiculous movement, I think, that they were so worried about things that only a tiny percentage of people, mostly elderly women, worried about it all. So again, it's very much a political charade.
Much like a lot of things that we see.
Yeah, pretty much everything. Unfortunately, it's very difficult. Whenever you read the news or whether it's mainstream alternative, you really have to parse what the agenda is, what the who benefits, whose ox is being gored, on all accounts. And I think that people will say, all right, I'm not going to believe the mainstream media anymore, so now I'll believe, unquestioningly believe what the alternative media has to say, not realizing that oftentimes the same corporate interests are controlling both spheres. So, you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Again, it's the men behind the curtain.
Yeah.
So I think that if you really want to deal with any sort of esoterica, and esoteric is such a broad range description, but it's sort of like not accepting the mainstream version of reality. You really have to be very, very careful about what agendas are out there, who is putting forth what agenda. I mean, it's amazing to me how many people will claim to be, quote-unquote new age, spiritual, but not religious, blah, 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 and they end up talking about things like Bluebeam, things that are basically fundamentalist propaganda. It's kind of upsetting to me because, again, you can trade one slave master for another, but you're still a slave. Your mind is still a slave.
That's very well said, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think skepticism is very important, and that's the small s kind, as you so rightfully referred to it as. And everybody needs to really consider where they're going whenever they decide to go down a path, and realize that there are a lot of different people out there and a lot of different forces behind the scenes that try to move and control things. And to try to influence the outcome of whatever it is that's happening. And the esoteric field is just as rife with them as your everyday politics and economics and the world stage. And so you're not outside of that the possibility of control, even when you think you're outside of the mainstream. And as you rightly pointed out, alternative media, just blindly accepting it as being the truth, when mainstream media is rejected, is also just as foolish as sitting in front of the TV, being hypnotized by, the corporate mouthpieces on there.
Well, I'll tell you, I had a real revelation when several years ago I was working in New York, and somebody had a copy of the New York Post open on the lunch table in this office that I was working in. And I just happened to scan past it, and everything was like fear, riot, death, crash. I mean, everything was like these negative words that they were punching you in the face with, and then you turn the page and then it's advertising. It was this interesting conditioning process where you raise the fear and anxiety and uncertainty, and then you mollify it with the advertising. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting that so much alternative media uses the same exact techniques. For instance, they'll hit you with a lot of fear, and, an extreme sort of anxiety-inducing stories and whatnot, and then buy gold, or buy seeds, buy colloidal silver supplements, or whatever.
Yeah.
They're hitting you with all this fear, and then it's like where the mainstream media is saying, buy a new fur coat, buy an air conditioner, buy a Chrysler, you'll be sexy, you'll feel better about yourself, blah blah blah. The alternative media is doing the same thing. Buy our seed package, from when the entire food system collapses. Buy gold, buy. It's the same exact techniques to induce people into such a state of almost paralyzing fear that they will buy anything, as the answer to this. And I've been around long enough to see, so many apocalypses come and go. As it were.
Well, let's say go for the most part, because none of them ever actually came. But you're so right. Geez, over the years we've had how many doom and gloom sayers say the end of the world was just around the corner. And
Y2K,
Yeah, that was a perfect example. I mean, everybody was waiting for all the computers to shut down, the grid to go dead, every possible apocalyptic scenario. I know a person personally who got one of those you get it all together as one thing. It was like a concrete hut, supposedly like a bomb shelter type thing to store all your survival supplies in, and plunked it down in their yard, thinking that the end of the world was coming. And they actually bought it.
Yeah, a friend of mine pointed out something interesting that, in 1998, when everybody got their credit cards with the year 2000 on it, that already sort of invalidated the entire idea that, the banks at least were going to go down.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but that's so true. I mean, how could their computers even have registered that if the bug hadn't already been figured out by the banks? That's really an excellent point. It really is.
Well, it's the same thing with the Bluebeam thing. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've read on the internet people swearing up and down that this is right around the corner. This is a real program. If you question the validity of this program, you're a Luciferian dupe and all the rest of it. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this post, is I wanted people to see that it's a hoax. It's a joke. It's something that I personally believe was fed to this guy, and the reason it was fed to him is that he would obviously have credibility as an extremist, as a radical, as a militant fundamentalist. So the repercussions of that are what we see. I mean, people take it seriously because he was not seen as somebody who would watch Star Trek or whatever.
Plus, he had an automatic following. I mean, he had an automatic following. Being an extremist religious leaders have like an automatic core following. Whatever they say, whatever they tell their people, they take that as being literally the quote-unquote gospel truth. And I think when they start to disseminate that, then it gains a life of its own. And that certainly contributed to Bluebeam becoming so widespread and so widely believed.
Yeah, he died, I guess, when he was in his early 50s. But I am sure, because I study this stuff, that this separatist cult that he was forming or he's leading would inevitably be exposed as, filled with sexual abuse and all these sort of things. Because anytime you see these groups, I have a pet theory that these extremist political cults or religious cults are basically venues to control people through fear and then sexually exploit them. And the media doesn't necessarily like to publicize these facts. But if you know where to look, there are some good websites that document this, that these separatist groups and these fundamentalist cults and whatnot are just hotbeds of sexual abuse and exploitation, which is really sad. And so many weak people out there who need to be led, who need to be controlled. And, of course, the main method of control is fear and inducing people to fear. Religions have done this for years. If you don't obey us, you will go to hell. I mean, what could be a graver threat with hostage? It's It's a very common thing, and that's another reason why I think people need to be skeptical, because there are been, particularly when I was growing up in the 70s, people using, I guess, sort of an alternative viewpoint or a conspiratorial viewpoint on the world to form cults that would either be financially or sexually exploitative. And I do believe, and I've always said this, and I'm sure a lot of people, your listeners, won't argue that I do believe that a lot of these groups were intelligence fronts. I think certainly Jim Jones.
Absolutely.
Unification Church. Just up and down the line, that these groups, these cults, were basically created to facilitate exploitation, slave labor, things like this. And they always are big. All these cults were huge on apocalyptic. That's why Jim Jones took everybody down to Guyana, to sit out the apocalypse. When you tell people that you will save them, when you can convince people, actually, that you will save them from an eternity or from the apocalypse or whatever, from any kind of suffering, you can get them to do pretty much anything. It's a horrible, horrible part of the human condition.
Oh, absolutely. And, just in the general and broad sense of the word, I believe organized religion, as you even touched on it yourself, is a way to control people. It always has been. It always will be. There's always a dogma that has to be followed. There's always a certain path that you have to take, and of course the religious leaders are the ones that have the ultimate authority and decide what is acceptable and what isn't. Cults are just a more extreme form for the most part.
Concentrated form, yeah.
Yeah, very concentrated.
Let me just say this. One thing I do say, that there are shades of gradation here, that there are certain denominations or sects that part of the overall organized phenomenon, but are generally more benign, generally less exploitative. I don't like to paint all of religion with a broad brush. I don't want to paint all of Christianity or Judaism or Islam with the same very negative elements within them, but there are also elements that are positive or neutral or what have you. I grew up with a relatively conservative Christian upbringing, and I look back on that as being a positive influence. Mm-hmm. But it was not a situation where it was a cult of personality or it was authoritarian or whatnot. Today I was just reading in the Philadelphia Inquirer that the district attorney is going after, actually he's sick of it now, he's going after the cardinal because the cardinal had basically allowed children to be gang raped by several different priests and whatnot on a couple different occasions. Really egregious, horrific abuse. It boggles my mind how that organization can continue to function when thousands of examples of human abuse and degradation. But anyhow, that's unfortunately what happens again in these groups, particularly Orthodox Jewish groups, some of these splinter groups. We've been hearing a lot about these Mormon splinter groups with the child brides and everything like that. Mm-hmm. But again, there is such a sense of fear and terror instilled within these groups that the outside world is this horrific place that is just filled with threat and death and fear and everything like that you become so completely dependent, and people are raised like this. The generations are raised like this, and I think again that's why I think we need to be skeptical of people within the alternative informational community that are using some of these same techniques, or people who are developing these cults of personality. in which they there's seen as some messiah that is going to fight the New World Order or whatnot.
Give me a break.
Yeah, when you do a little digging and you find out that who's pulling their strings as well. But again, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this whole thing on Bluebeam, is because I wanted people to see how easily a hoax can be pulled over people who don't necessarily, I'm not expecting people to be as familiar with, obscure Star Trek episodes as I am, but these things are pulled out. Another big, it was actually an interview that I'd done on the blog was with Nick Redfern, who was talking about this fundamentalist group that has been pushing since the late 1940s this whole UFO demon meme, and UFOs are just demons in disguise and everything like that. And we talked about that on my show when he was on. Mm-hmm. And what they want to do is basically create a theo-fascist garrison state, a surveillance state, or an Orwellian / fundamentalist surveillance state. So that's what happens. When you allow yourself to enter into this fear mode, it just becomes, you open yourself up to immense manipulation.
I agree, and I think it was a good byword for you to say and to point out that neither you nor I wants to paint religion with a broad brush, and I was only speaking in a very broad sense that religion is about control. And let's face it, that the longer, more established religions, they don't exercise the same level of control they did, like, say, in the Middle Ages, where people literally lived and died depending on the church's favors, as it were. So it's a different world now.
Can you imagine the abuse that must have been going on in the Middle Ages? It's mind-boggling.
Well, considering what they did in the name of God around the world, one can only imagine what happened behind the scenes that we don't even know about. It had to be really horrible. And certainly the term Dark Ages for a good period of that time is very appropriate for some of the evil that must have been going on at that time. But to wrap up the Bluebeam idea, where do you think Monas got this information from? Do you have an idea of where he might have obtained this information?
Yeah, I think it was fed to him. I think that there are people who sort of float these ideas and just see how they play. And I think that somebody who had access to, for instance, some of the published military papers, I guess from the U.S. Army College and such, that he cited, somebody who would have access to that. I have no idea he would have had access to that himself. Particularly, this is not, the World Wide Web was not really in everybody's home at the time. And, he was apparently living on some separatist compound. So I think it was fed to him, and he was selected because he would be a very convincing spokesperson for it. And I think he added in all the usual nonsense about Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and this whole litany that you see, this whole witch hunt scapegoat litany that is so prevalent these days. He added that in, because he was just grinding his own axes. He had his own agenda but the rest of it seems a little too well researched and a little too geeky for somebody like him to have written. So I definitely, and I said so. Richard Dolan said, he wasn't necessarily ready to sign on to that theory, but I do think that that's probably the most plausible explanation, that either a bunch of renegade Trekkies tracked down this obscure fundamentalist cult leader, or somebody in some intelligence circle selected him to put this forward.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most likely scenario as well.
Yeah.
Do you think that if someone set him up, especially some wacky Star Trek-y people, certainly someone would have stepped forward to take credit for such a fantastic hoax. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, well, media hoaxes aren't what they used to be. I remember there was this guy who was, and this is back in the 80s, who was responsible for, he would float all these hoaxes, but he always sort of came clean, after a while. Once the hoax circulated for a while, he would come clean, and everybody like, oh, that guy, what a card, what a panic. And that's the end of it. But I think there's a darker flip side to that as well. Of what's the best example of this is weapons of mass destruction and Al Qaeda in Iraq. Under Saddam Hussein. That's sort of the I guess the less humorous variant on that whole phenomenon.
Or
fake intelligence.
A mainstream version of the same, rather than something a little bit more out there and esoteric in its flavor, if you will, but still nonetheless a complete and total hoax, a lie from the get-go, as it turns out. So yeah, I think the intelligence agent angle is probably the most likely, because we certainly have proof that intelligence agents have been involved with various fringe religious groups throughout the years, and they've used them for various reasons. And it wouldn't surprise me that Monast would have been used in that regard in order to put out a certain scenario. And I think that scenario is the idea of sort of lending the credence to the idea that the powers that be that control, everything from behind the scenes have such ability and such power that they can pretty much hoodwink anybody. So it kind of sets up the idea that it's futile to resist the coming, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, it's futile.
World order, whatever.
Futile. It's futile and it's futile. I mean, it creates this whole feudal mentality where the Lord and Master is unassailable and has magical powers and can hear you wherever you are and see you wherever you are. It's interesting. There was an article, I think last week. And I've been watching this organization or this bureau or this office or whatever they are for a number of years, and they're constantly announcing the most outlandish technologies that never ever ever make it to the battlefield. I think a lot of this is maybe some of it might be wishful thinking, and some of it just might be flat out disinformation. The best way to it's psyching somebody out. This is like goes to junior high school. When you can sort of convince somebody that you're going to beat them up, it becomes easier to beat them up. You know what I mean? Or you convince somebody that that you have magical powers, you create an expectation, a sense of expectation that is going to want to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
And, I think that is something that I think is very disturbing. And, certainly this whole thing going on in Egypt. I mean, I'm a little bit more skeptical, not necessarily skeptical, but I'm maybe a little more pessimistic about the road ahead in Egypt. But certainly, getting rid of Mubarak is a positive. Getting rid of an autocratic dictator who has funneled billions and billions of dollars into his own pockets is a plus in any regard. But at the same time, I mean, power is being now transferred to a military junta necessarily. I mean, I guess maybe going from an autocrat to a junta is progress. But the point being here is that I'm sure people felt for years that he could not be overthrown, that he was untouchable. Again, I mean, there's going to be all sorts of theories on how exactly that happened, but it happened, and I think that we've seen. Who would have ever thought that the Soviet Union would fall?
Well, I know I grew up at the same time period you did, and it was always painted as this giant behemoth that could never, it's always going to be there. It's always going to be our enemy. The Cold War, duck and cover, all that kind of stuff. I mean,
well, look at how Star Trek still had, in the 23rd century, still had communism. Still had Chekhov being sort of a Soviet patriot chauvinist character.
Yeah, even in the movies.
Yes.
I mean, it showed up in the movies as well. I mean, the Klingons themselves were very much in that mold too, I believe, in some of the movies.
The original Klingons, definitely, absolutely.
Yes, and not that they were a direct expression of communist ideology per se, but they were like the Stalinist bogeymen, sort of. I guess we are superior. We will crush you. We're your ultimate enemy, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's really Gene Roddenberry sort of came out of this muscular, great society, Camelot liberalism. This whole idea that America is more enlightened and freer, and that ultimately is ordained by Providence to win the space race and whatnot. And what we see is that the Federation and Starfleet, that we have all these people in Earth, but they're all under the same aegis. So the aliens become the enemy, and there was always the understanding that the Klingons were the Russians and that the Romulans were the Red Chinese. That was always sort of the shorthand. And then, in the Next Generation era, things become, a little more difficult, because this is the whole glasnost, perestroika, that whole period under Gorbachev and everything like that. And it became a little less acceptable for these sort of binary good guy, bad guy battles. And that's one of the reasons why, and this sort of takes us back to the Nine in some ways itself, but, the last, what I consider the last canonical Star Trek series, which would be Deep Space Nine, has a much more, not only cynical idea of politics and real politic, as it were, but it also sort of paints the Federation itself as sort of this soft fascist state, that it's it's almost as insidious and overwhelming as the Borg themselves. And you hear all these characters sort of expressing skepticism over the claims of the Federation. And to me, that was something that was very revolutionary. This is something Gene Roddenberry himself would have never signed on to that, because he comes from a different generation. But that's one of the reasons why I think that series is so great, because it doesn't have this Federation automatically good idea to it. The Federation is a lot more problematic, that it's not quite so cut and dried. And the interesting thing about that is that this series also gets back to this whole idea of alien gods. That's sort of the current running through it, that it's about this character, Benjamin Sisko, who I sort of compared to Barack Obama during the election, well before he was elected. But it was, this whole messianic expectation. There's this whole character, in that series that's seen as the Messiah, seen as this stranger riding in on the white horse, saving everybody. That whole very naive and simplistic propaganda that we saw from some liberals during the election, that all we need to do is elect Obama and change is a fait accompli. And that's what I'm afraid of with Egypt, that there's this whole expectation, and once you get rid of the big bad witch, then things change. But that's not the way it works. And certainly we've seen that electing Obama was not the be all end all of anything. That a lot of times your problems just begin. And again, this is a lot of this ideas is what they explored in Deep Space Nine. And one of the main writers on that show was Ronald Moore, who went on to do Battlestar Galactica, which again itself had a lot of these currents. not only political but also esoteric religious ideas of artificial intelligence and whatnot. And this sort of brings me to this point that time to time I'll have people say, oh, this is all juvenilia, this is all just nonsense, but it's like people don't understand that culture has always been the undergirding of any successful society, and also mythology, that we need to have a very potent mythological undergirding, because in a lot of ways it sort of goads us on, it pushes us on. And, in this era where in my lifetime I've really seen the collapse of organized religion, that I remember growing up and my friends were so terrified of the priests and the nuns and everything like that they were just almost, they could be paralyzed into this state of fear, that even though they were just completely disregarding everything they said, they had this tremendous guilt and self-loathing that arose because of that. And that's certainly, I think, in Western culture is not what we're dealing with. But in some ways, when that collapses, a vacuum is formed. And in a lot of ways, people are filling the vacuum with a lot of things that I don't think are necessarily positive. Certainly this whole trash, junk, celebrity culture that is so toxic, that is just filled with negative, mimetic power. A lot of people talk about this whole idea of the pop stars and the occult and everything like that. And, certainly it's a very conscious process that this is how they're selling now, because sex doesn't sell anymore, right? We've been so inured to sex that it doesn't really work anymore. So now what they're selling is this whole idea that they're all part of this grand conspiracy, and they're all sold their soul to the devil, and this whole thing that all comes from things like Marilyn Manson and Alice Cooper, and going back, really to the early days of rock and roll with Screaming Jay Hawkins. This whole idea that, even before that, Robert Johnson, right, the Crossroads, selling soul to the devil, So, but now it's become mainstream. People like Lady Gaga and Jay-Z. I mean, to me, it's all just, this music is so intensely horrible that you have to sell it with something else. It's like drinking a cup of spit. You need something to sort of wash it down with, and that's what all this salesmanship is about. I doubt very seriously that any of these people are initiates of any esoteric tradition whatsoever. I really do.
Especially Lady Gaga. I mean, give me a break with that.
It's absurd. I mean, the woman just seems completely, consumed with enriching herself. She reminds me. She's sort of like, you're familiar with the Gnostic myth of creation and these emanations that become more and more deformed and more degraded. It's kind of like taking a Xerox, a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox. And she's, to me, like a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox of Madonna, who herself was a Xerox of several other, of Cher and David Bowie and other people. She was putting all these ideas together. But it's all really just completely about self-aggrandizement. It's all completely about narcissism. It's all completely about the ego. And it is very troubling to me, because when children role model themselves off of this, I'm not sure how many necessarily do, but there's always this danger of not necessarily the occult itself, because I think that's, again, it's not necessarily real or sincere, but this whole idea of complete materialism, of narcissism. That's why I would say that these shows, these so-called reality shows, are even more dangerous, than a Marilyn Manson video, because they present this whole idea that you are living your life on camera. And I see this. I see people. It's astonishing to me. In public places, at the mall or in restaurants or whatever, and you can tell that they are acting as if they are being filmed. You know, that they see their life as this reality show, and it's so it's so incredibly distorting.
It is. So when we talk about, I'm sorry, I lost you there. Broke up a little bit.
Okay. But anyway, that's basically what I'm saying, is that to me, I see this idea of these reality shows when nobody actually acts genuinely, nobody acts naturally or honestly.
No.
And of course, all the manufactured drama and the manufactured conflict, it boggles my mind. It's so juvenile, but that becomes what people see. They think that this is reality, and that's how they model their own reality off of. It's really like it's some ancient Gnostic's nightmare vision.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the whole idea of the Gnosticism and the mystery religions and their influence on modern day culture, pop culture, movies, music. As you pointed out, you wrote an article on the blog about how the music industry's use of esoteric symbolism is a distraction. It's, as you said, it's a trap in best Admiral Akbar sense, I imagine.
Hey, bonus points for that, man.
It's a trap for people to be bogged down in an effort to try to understand what's going on, saying, is Jay-Z a member of the Masons? Is he a member of some secret society? Is Lady Gaga trying to tell us something secret in her messages, in her music? We have to, travel down this pathway. We have to, dissect her music, and that means, of course, buying more of it and getting more involved in her life and making her more of a sensation by being so focused on her, and the same thing with all these other people, and you pointed out something so fundamental that people should really understand, and that is that these things are being put up on YouTube and all these other video share sites, and they're not being taken down, and they do DCMAs on the most trivial things. But if there was some conflict with the overall agenda here, or if it was going against something that they wanted to promote, that would be taken down instantly. And the fact that it isn't is the number one thing to tell me that what's being perpetrated there is exactly what they want to be perpetrated. And they want these videos to be out there so people are constantly saying, like, well, what's he trying to say with this? And he has this symbol in his video, or she's doing this, and it's just this constant talk, and making that such a staple for people to talk about just automatically throws publicity their way and generates more money and more interest, and
absolutely.
And Admiral Akbar is right. It's a trap.
Yes. You're being lured. First of all, for a true narcissist, there's no such thing as negative publicity. For a true narcissist, any attention is a plus, is a bonus. But it's also this distraction where there are serious problems in the economy, serious problems in personal liberty and personal freedom, serious threats that have nothing to do with the Freemasons or the Illuminati or anything like that. That this is an agenda, a globalist agenda that's about economics. It's about corporations and banks and things like this have basically, exercise control over the government and find personal liberty and protections, protections, all these sort of things as obstacles for profit.
You're talking my language now.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
So what's the best way to channel, when you channel that concern into these imaginary straw men? There's so many agendas being fed here. There's so many purposes being fulfilled here that, first of all, it's taking people's minds off of real problems, real challenges to their basic livelihood and well-being. It's creating this absurd, imaginary villain. It's sort of like the Illuminati, Goldstein. This whole idea of this imaginary threat that has nothing to do with real power exercised over us on a daily basis. And as you said, and as I've said, if this whole idea of exposing all these pop stars as Satanists or Illuminists or Freemasons or whatever, villainous straw man or scapegoat you can name, if that was in any way even a remote threat to the bottom line of the corporations that control their careers, those videos would be pulled in the snap of a finger. And I'll tell you something. I go back, where I put a lot of YouTube posts, and I'm constantly looking at old blogs that I've done where the videos have been pulled. For just completely negligible reasons. Or a simple copyright issue. That I'll put a video up and BMG or Sony or EMI, whoever you can name, has pulled it on copyright grounds. So all these videos that are showing the entirety of Lady Gaga's Alejandro video or Jay-Z's Run This Town or whatever video you can name, that's copyright infringement. They don't need to justify it on any political grounds. This is our entire video is being shown here and re-shown and replayed. This is unacceptable. This is simple copyright infringement. We don't care what these guys' agenda is. They can have it pulled, snap of a finger. They don't. There's thousands of it because it's viral marketing in a way. It is a form of viral marketing that they are, by creating this forbidden mystique. And all the people who say that they're outraged by this are all liars and hypocrites. They're fascinated by this. They love it. They soak it up. It satisfies their prurient fascination with forbidden topics and all the rest of it. They're all liars and hypocrites. But when you see 1,000 videos using copyrighted material, again, if it was even a shadow, a whisper of a threat to the bottom line, those things would be gone. So I think, it's all just a big hoax and and too many people who pay attention to that are not paying attention to outsourcing or whatever real problems that we're dealing with that are putting, our future and our children's future in serious jeopardy at this point in time.
Yeah, and look at where the music is generally focused, and where media is generally focused on younger people, and they're the people that really are going to have to deal with a lot of the major problems that we're focusing that are focusing down on us right now as a people, and taking a form of entertainment and using it as a propaganda tool for the most part. I mean, really, that's what it boils down to, because they're causing them to be focused in on looking at trying to uncover the hidden truth of something whenever, they're losing their house or they're out of work. They're not focusing on real world issues that are important or should be important to them. They're not talking about, what are we going to do to make the world a better place? What are we going to do to make our future more secure? They're wondering what Lady Gaga is going to do in her next video, or what kind of secret symbolism is going to show up in Jay-Z's or Kanye West or whatever, and it's like a huge disinformation campain by like the corporations and the people with the money.
Yes, absolutely, and a very interesting byproduct of this, that it sort of whets people's appetite for esotericism or for Freemasonry or whatnot. I remember there was this guy back in the old internet. I've been on the internet for years now, and I mean, we're talking like 2,400 dial-up days, America Online, charged by the minute, crazy stuff like that. And, so many people who start out, being anti-Masonic or anti-occult or whatever like that, you can almost, I saw, in one particular example, this evolution where they're so immersed in something that they eventually, become consumed by it. And it's sort of like, the guy who is secretly obsessed with pornography becomes the anti-porn crusader. The guy who's a closet case becomes the anti-gay crusader. And I think, the same thing happens with Masonry or any sort of occult thing that you can think about. It tends to exercise its power. And maybe that there is almost this sort of process where you start out being, that it's opposite to your, your original program, and then you sort of end up reprogramming yourself or being reprogrammed through it. And I don't want to make too much of this because in some instances, I think it is on the wane, and I think that it's sort of playing itself out. But it fits into a general phenomenon where people are being distracted, through the use of scapegoating and through the use of straw men and imaginary conspiracies and imaginary villains that obscure the real conspiracies, that can obscure the real villains. And another point that I want to raise that I think is really important is that people need to be very cognizant of the use of language. It's like people throw around the term New World Order, and certainly people like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton or Vladimir Putin or whoever you could name, usually outside the U.S. in the foreign press are very open about using that terminology, that New World Order is something that they're working towards. But unfortunately, New World Order takes on this connotation of gun nuts and religious fanatics. I think the term that people should be using, and it is much more focused, and is going to be, whatever argument you're going to make is going to be more persuasive to people, is to use the term globalism. Rather than New World Order, use the term globalism. And people understand that because when they hear the term globalism, they understand, that's what's threatening my job and my career and all this sort of thing. And instead of conspiracy, which again is another loaded word with a lot of connotations that are necessarily unhelpful, is corruption. Corruption. That is something that people understand, that people experience, and it's basically synonymous, but it's a much less loaded, it's a much less weighted word. Words.
You're right.
Words are triggers. Okay. Words have power, and words gone meanings that not necessarily their original intention. So people, us, it's very important to understand how language works, and to understand how words can be sort of co-opted in a sense. Words can be sort of appropriated for other purposes, and by being cognizant of the power of language, you will make your arguments, necessarily much more effective. And that sort of ties back to, a lot of the things that I do on the blog, is understanding where words come from, word origins, etymology, but also where symbols come from, what they mean. Symbols can have multiple meanings, can have multiple purposes, can have multiple intents. It's very important, I think, to understand where this is all coming, because this stuff is being thrown at you all the time. There's this media stream where people who understand the power of language, people who understand the power of symbols, are constantly using it to try and manipulate you. So it's very important in that regard. So maybe in some senses, the silly Lady Gaga stuff, it's almost like for some people, for people, it might be, the initiation point, and that will bring them, maybe to a more sophisticated understanding of how language and symbol are used. That you start off with this sort of sensationalistic version of this. But I think it is very important that you do understand where all these symbols come from, because they are being constantly thrown at you. A lot of times, one thing that I think is a very important issue as well is, not everything has some grand occult design behind it. These symbols are out in the public. There is no occult anymore. Occult is no longer a useful term, because everything is published, everything is known, everything is disseminated. So not every symbol means the Illuminati are trying to infiltrate your breakfast cereal or whatever. Sometimes symbols, and that's why understanding that symbol is a language is another important point I want to raise here. Is that symbols, words, letters, they're all symbolic, right? It's
absolutely.
We've constructed this system of sounds that symbolize certain ideas or whatever.
Yeah.
So
a lot of people don't realize that language itself, words, and everything that goes along with it is purely symbolic.
Exactly.
It's just like math. Numbers are a complete abstract thing. They have no real existence. And words and language are completely and purely symbolic. A word has, it's by itself, it's nothing. It's only a representation of something else.
Yes, and at the same time that language is symbolic, symbols are linguistic. Okay.
Yeah, the reverse is true. Yeah.
Yes. So that's why I think it's very important to understand the meaning of symbols. Again, so you understand the purpose of it, and not that not everything has some grand apocalyptic portent to it.
And I think like you could look, for example, maybe I could just toss something out there and see if you agree with me. If you look, for example, at corporate logos and understand that the symbolism being used there is not trying to portray the corporation as being part of a grand global conspiracy, because it's using an esoteric symbol, in its logo, but because there is a certain measure of power in the symbol itself, that it's just meant to capture your attention. It's meant to it be something to draw you towards it, so that it's sort of like its own like a way of advertising. It's just a stronger form of advertising by using a symbol that has a certain kind of power to draw your attention, as it were.
Yes, and now that the cat is sort of out of the bag with the deeper meaning of these symbols, one thing you have to be sort of on the lookout is what I call false flag symbolism, or intentional manipulation and things like that. So it's all, it's all very complex. It's something that you can spend a lifetime sort of studying.
Oh, geez.
And and still not completely understand. Interestingly enough, the jump-on point for me with this whole concept was the book Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, and how there was a sort of a coffee table edition of this published in the 60s that I had read quite some time ago, and sort of the whole visual approach that I sort of use on the blog was very much influenced by that book, and also another book that I don't know if a lot of your listeners might be familiar with, but there's a guy named Desmond Morris who's an anthropologist, and wrote a book called Man Watching, and basically, he took the whole the tools of I guess zoological observation and applied them to people, body language, things like that, and that's a whole other topic of things, but just this whole idea of that we have linguistic communication, but we have a whole host of other modes of communication on top of that I think is all part of what I do in the blog as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I really do enjoy your posts on there. Your recent series that you did on Star Wars was exceptional, I thought, in laying out the esoteric angles to George Lucas. But I want to talk a little bit about that. But before I do, I just wanted to go into one other little aspect here. That's sort of like a side note to what you were talking about, how the bottom line of the corporation is the real driving force in all of this, and talking about how the videos are not DMCA'd off of YouTube because they're actually doing promotion for these people. But we also want to look at the idea that just, as we said before, don't trust just the alternative media as opposed to the mainstream media as well, because you have to look at who's behind it and realize that a lot of the alternative media has the same corporate sponsors that the mainstream media has. It's just better hidden. It's not right out there in the open. Like GE owns NBC, so right there that you have, GE propaganda is going to be on NBC.
Actually, Comcast owns it now.
Comcast. So when you look at alternative media, you don't see that right up front, corporate sponsorship. But it's there. These people are unaware of it. And I think that a lot of agendas are being foisted on people from the alternative side as well. And as you pointed out very eloquently, the alternative media does the exact same thing as the mainstream media does. You could look at 100 different websites. You could look at InfoWars or any of the countless clones of that, and you can see exactly what you're talking about. I have a story about the coming food crisis, and then right next to that link, they'll have a buy this seed vault for your future. It'll save you from the coming food shortages, or the economy is going to crash, and then right next door is buy our gold.
Yes,
to save yourself, and
yeah. I know.
Yeah, and you have to realize there's money behind that. There are corporations behind that too. That are foisting this idea and serving an agenda.
Well, this sort of ties back. I mean, we can sort of buy into this whole idea of GE is owned by GE and Comcast is owned by Comcast. That the whole idea of corporate ownership and holding companies and capital investment groups. I mean, it's all so tortured, and a lot of. I mean, I'm sure if you looked into some of these, I don't know, like Republic Broadcast Network or GCN or some of these groups, that you would start to sort of tie it back to some of these groups, but everything is so purposefully decentralized as far as ownership these days, that there are so many hedge funds, different working groups. Of course, everybody knows about the Carlyle Group, but they're a good example of these, how just completely incestuous and decentralized the whole the power structure is. But it's these people all have very similar agendas. They all socialize. They all serve on each other's boards. They all own stock in each other's companies. So it tends to be it'd be very difficult to sort of parse where exactly the money is coming from, because there are just this spider web of interests that sort of keep this whole machine working.
Well, just the whole idea of there being a spider web is enough to lead you to a conclusion that some of that money has to be coming from some of those same players on the mainstream side, because everything is connected behind the scenes in a spider web like that. And all these people do know each other. They play golf together. They're on the same boards with each other. They own each other's stock, and And I just think that it's a good idea to be just as wary of the alternative media as you pointed out, and I'm sure you'd be the first person to say that Christopher Knowles does not have the answers to everything. And
no, God, I don't know what I exactly have the answers to myself. Yeah,
and I'm sure you would tell people, don't just accept what you say. You need to do your own research and come up to your own conclusions about things, and that's what I tell people as well. Don't just listen to me or to any other person that you happen to have latched onto and accept what they say and run out and do what they tell you to do. Check it out before you do anything, and realize that there are a lot of things that can be used as a method of controlling you, and you won't even realize you're being controlled. You'll be completely oblivious to it. And you'll think you'll be doing something that's for the betterment of yourself, but in actuality, you're being driven to do it by some other focus. And I just wanted to caution people on that, and just reiterate what you said before, just so people would realize that it's important to be focused on that as well. But I wonder if we could.
One of the things that I always say, and
yeah.
I'll repeat it here, is that I'm more interested in questions than answers.
Yes.
And really what I try to do is, like, whether it's actually there or it's invisible, that everything I do has got a question mark on it, that it's an open-ended question. Because people are going to have different answers to the same question. And I think that, that understanding that one size does not fit all, that one philosophy does not fit all, mm-hmm. that one agenda or necessarily esoteric understanding fits all, that we have different parts to play, we come from different backgrounds, on and on and on. I think it is very important, and one thing that I always want to encourage people is to find their own answers. Maybe I'll raise a particular question, but I think it's very important for people to find their own answers, because that's being an individual. That's maybe that's the last bastion of individuality that we're sort of allowed, is coming up with your own answers to different questions. And I think that is a very important thing. I have my own viewpoint. I have my own biases. I have my own quirks that I bring to my work. But I'm not trying to do anything but share information with people. And yes. People are free to accept it or reject it, and that is fine mm-hmm. with me. My only interest is in sharing information.
Yes.
I am not leading a crusade. I am not trying to further a particular agenda, other than this rediscovery of of a richness of this cultural and symbolic and ideational heritage that we share. And the thing that is frustrating to me is that, this natural reductionism, and that sort of extends to culture. That, to me, and this is kind of funny, because I always say that this whole idea of what the skeptics and the atheists, that's not going to result in a race of Carl Sagans and Marlis False savants, because that's not what human nature dictates. I mean, not everybody is going to be super intelligent or self-directed. When you take, again, it's this whole vacuum that was created by the collapse, what I think is a beneficial collapse ultimately, but this collapse of, traditionalism, of traditional religion specifically, that created a vacuum. But what's filled the vacuum? Hedonism, narcissism, materialism.
Mm-hmm.
Those are not positive developments in my view. And of course, I'm an extreme minority, I guess, in this, but I feel obliged to share my view. It doesn't matter, whether you're a Christian narcissist or an atheist narcissist. You know, it doesn't matter whether you believe that somebody should accept your atheist viewpoint or your Islamic viewpoint. You know, that you should necessarily force that idea because it's it's best for other people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the outcome is the same. It's the outcome is equally negative in those instances. So I think that what we need to sort of start to work towards is a new I don't necessarily want to use the word esoteric, but a new point of view, a new way of describing reality that transcends simple materialism, simple reductionism. Those
luckily,
things. Go ahead.
Luckily we have some people now who are looking into that and who are trying to grasp some of the greater meanings behind things and to look at things in a more broad perspective. Now, I think it's a blossoming time. I mean, in the one hand, but there's some other things going on too that are just as negative in another direction as well. But I think I'm pretty positive about an approach like you're talking about, where people need to grasp a broader understanding of reality and to try to get behind the physical reality that we sort of just live in every day and accept at face value, and try to come to terms with something on a broader scale. And I see more people willing to do that today than I have any other time that I can remember in my lifetime anyway.
Well, it's because they have access now. I mean, before reality was dictated by major media outlets,
Yeah.
3 or 4 networks,
yeah.
Time Magazine, New York Times. I mean, there was such a filter for most people on the flow of information. Certain people, would go looking for alternative viewpoints, but most people did not. I think now it's a question of access. It's a question of accessibility to different viewpoints. I was lucky, living where I live, because, for instance, the local independent college radio station would play Alan Watts lectures every week. You know what I'm saying? And
yes.
That was a great thing that maybe somebody in, even in the south of the state or in the west of the state would not have access to this. And, talk about somebody who, was so instrumental in bringing, Zen philosophy and, different Eastern philosophies and making them accessible for Westerners. I think that was a very important thing. But I was lucky enough to have access to that. I was lucky enough when I was growing up. I was living in Boston, where there was 10 million universities, 10 million college radio stations, newsstands, alternative record stores, all different outlets for non-mainstream information. So I think that process that you're describing, and I do agree that it is a very positive thing, is because people don't have to necessarily accept ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, whatever filters were being put on their access to information.
Yes, I think that's true, and because of the internet, we have that ability to get to sources a lot easier than doing a lot of heavy research that would be required otherwise. But we only got.
Look at sacredtext.com. You're familiar with that site, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Sacred Text. We're talking about books that had been spoken of in whispers, for hundreds or thousands of years, and are accessible to everyone now.
Yes.
And I don't want to be too Pollyannish about the internet because, for every sacredtext.com, there are 10,000 sites of videos of guys punching themselves in the balls, whatever. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
absolutely.
There's just as much garbage and nonsense out there. But
very true.
Here's what's going to happen, and I think this is very important, because this what people are being distracted of. Say the pie of the world, the world economy. I mean, Egypt now is going to be open for business, and American companies are going to start moving their factories to Egypt now because it's safer for them, because it will be more stable democracy. So that it's good for them, not so good for us. So this is a process that's been going on for a long time.
Yes.
Our financial and our material well-being is going to be stressed and challenged, in many different ways for everybody around the world, which is why putting all your faith in materialism and in possessions and in this sort of reductionist, rationalist viewpoint is not necessary, because for most people a reductionist worldview is going to lead necessarily, by definition, to materialism. Mm-hmm. Now, materialism is going to become an increasingly difficult religion to maintain. So you need to find other outlets and other things to satisfy, the human condition. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it is very important, that there are other ways, rather than vacation in the Bahamas and a 45-inch plasma TV screen or 108-inch, and an Escalade, that we've been so conditioned. Particularly, I mean, this is the funny thing. When you talk about Jay-Z, to me, his Freemasonry is much more benign than the grotesque materialism that he and other rappers and the bling, this whole grotesque, consumerist, narcissistic materialism that rap videos have been promulgating since, the death of that whole Public Enemy kind of conscious rap. The corporate rap, which is always, promoting bling and just crass materialism. To me, that's much more destructive than him, I don't know, forming a pyramid over his eye. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to do. Am I supposed to wet my pants and run screams every time Rihanna covers one of her eyes? I mean, it's totally absurd, ridiculous. To me, I mean, when you talk about what that culture has been putting forward for people, particularly for people in minority neighborhoods that might not even be able to access that through, legitimate forms of income. To me, it's doubly grotesque and inappropriate.
Yes. And it goes right.
Crack dealer,
Yeah, it goes right along with what you were saying earlier. It's just it's a trap for people, and it promotes a lot of negative things for people, and especially amongst a lot of people who should be more focused on maybe things that are more primarily important in their lives. The whole Masonic thing, like you said, I'm like, what do I care? If I mean, what he's doing a Masonic hand sign, whatever, but at the same time, he's got how many cars and how many houses, and his music is all about getting more women, getting more sex, getting more money, getting more anything that you have, and it's that should be the real focus of people saying, what's it all about?
Yeah, that becomes the default setting when you take away any kind of, consciousness from people, whether, what about just the joy of learning, the joy of reading, I mean, I got to tell you something. I mean, it's just all these things that I'm fascinated with. I mean, I don't even think about needing to buy a Corvette or a Mustang to make my life more fulfilling, because I have ideas. You know, I have all these intellectual ideas and themes and interests that are fulfilling to me, that I don't need to fill that hole in my life with gadgets and you know, sort of self-aggrandizement and everything like that.
Yes.
You know? So I mean, maybe that's another thing I'm trying to do, is show people sort of the deeper strands of meaning behind things that they might necessarily take for granted. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have said to me, "Boy, you know, before you did that Star Wars thing, I just thought it was some dopey escapist fantasy, you know, and you sort of showed me, you know, the deeper strands of meaning behind that." And you know, well, as I said before, this sort of ties back to, you know, reading Man and His Symbols and whatnot. But there's this whole just other, you know, world experience behind that, and I think that in these days that of uncertainty and of stress and of hardship, that, you know, the world of ideas can be a very fulfilling safe harbor in many, many ways, you know, as it was for thousands of years. You know, I mean, the ancient philosophers just wanted to make sure that they had, you know, clothes on their back and food in their bellies, and then could spend the rest of their time exploring the world of ideas, you know?
Yes.
The world of the mind, okay? That's really what it boils down to. It's the world of the mind, you know? The world of ideas, the world of symbols, you know, the world of consciousness, all these sort of things that you don't need to fill that void with, you know, what the major corporations are trying to sell you that week.
That's true. Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna give you an opportunity to tell us what you're working on right now, if anything new, and to flog your various products and what have you.
Well, you did a great job sort of flogging my hair at the beginning. Right now, I'm sort of at an interesting junction where I'm sort of trying to decide how I want to proceed with my work, you know, what avenue I want to take. I do have an idea for a new book, but I don't necessarily just want to repeat what I've done before. I'm also working on my artwork and such, you know, concentrating on that, maybe trying to bring those different spheres together. You know, I just basically want to continue with exploring the roots of things that people take for granted in our culture. You know, and this, you know, just carrying on in that sense. I would like to do on the blog, I really want to start doing some more interviews. I was doing some interviews with people for a while, and then I sort of got sidetracked on other things. But there are a lot of people whose work I'm interested in that I would like to sort of turn people on to. You know, and just keeping the blog fresh. You know, I don't want to be too predictable with it. That to me, it's much more fulfilling and I think more entertaining when it stays spontaneous and fresh.
Well, you have so much material to work with. I don't think you're going to run out of stuff that you can parse out and get some deeper meaning to.
Yeah, I also have a huge backlog.
I'm sure you do.
I have a huge backlog of you know, like things like the Star Wars series. I have a huge backlog of stuff like that, sort of in the vault, as it were. But I also, you know, one thing I really want to be careful of too is I don't want to just, you know, burn people out. You know, I want to pace myself so I'm not just constantly hitting people with big, heavy stuff that they need to concentrate on. I think it's really important to, you know when to pull back a little bit and maybe sort of review what's been explored. Well, I don't want to overexpose myself or burn myself or burn people out on what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that's a real sound approach. And in the last couple minutes here we have left, let me just ask you for for your take on a couple of different things.
Okay.
One thing was the the internet rumor mill brought up by Seth Rogen about George Lucas really believing in the 2012 end of the world thing. That caused actually George Lucas to come out and say no, he didn't believe in that. He was just funning around with Seth Rogen when he had the conversation with him, and whether or not if there's even any bit of a grain of truth to that, do you suppose that some of that energy and focus was put into any of his work?
What, the 2012 stuff?
Yeah. Can you see any kind of significance off the top of your head there?
Well, I'll tell you something. When I did the Star Wars thing, I done it because I sort of came across this unauthorized bio of George Lucas in a used bookstore. So it was sort of apropos of nothing. But then all of a sudden, after I started putting the posts up, all the Star Wars stuff started hitting the media, and that was one of the first things that came out, which was kind of interesting in that regard. I don't really know what to make of that. You know, it wouldn't surprise me because he just seems to be such a strange, quirky character in a lot of ways.
Yes, indeed.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, I don't know if he necessarily has a spaceship, but, you know, we're hearing more of the stuff. You know, there's a lot of this stuff that's sort of hitting, you know, a lot of, you know, that recent flyby, that asteroid flyby, you know, sun activity, sunstorms, things like that. That movie Knowing, 2012. It seems to be circulating. I didn't really know what to make of that. It just seemed like such a strange story. To be perfectly honest, like knowing Seth Rogen as, you know, whatever way I do, which is through the media, it just seems like he was just goofing around, but who the hell knows?
Oh, yeah, it could very well be true. Then the last thing I wanted to ask you to just comment on briefly, if you could, is I had mentioned to you an email to you about the movie Skyline and how it very obviously played on this Bluebeam idea because it used blue beams in the movie, and the positive glut that we have of UFO invasion and alien movies coming out right now.
Yeah.
And I mean, is this like is this just a coming around again of a cultural phenomenon we've seen before, or is this like is this something more? I mean, in light of the Disclosure Project and all these other things about the government holding secrets about aliens and UFOs and all this stuff being so prominent in culture right now, I mean, what's your 1 minute take on that?
I think it's always sort of dangerous to link it towards disclosure or conditioning towards an oncoming invasion, because people have been down that road so many different times and nothing's ever come of it. Yes. In one regard, I think it had maybe a mundane or conventional way to explain it is I think it has to do with just the way we've become maybe a little more inward looking, a little bit more xenophobic. Those films to me, it's like the rest of reality outside our normal paradigm is terrifying. That's what they're all sort of saying. Anything alien, anything unknown, anything new is scary, and that to me is sort of symptomatic of a country that is deeply stressed out, uncertain, paranoid. And all the big movie studios have people who test the public mood and sort of gauge what kind of movies they should be working on, what trends, and they all imitate each other. So look at what we saw, getting back to the whole Y2K thing, where it was all these end of the world, end of days and movies like that. This whole and the way these are sort of bundled together and marketed as, everybody's afraid of the end of the world, so we're putting these movies out. That's the way Hollywood operates.
Okay.
None of these movies seem to be doing very well, though, do they?
No, they
Skyline
don't.
was a big flop.
Yeah, it was. It was indeed. Well, we're just about out of time here, so Christopher Knowles, I want to thank you for coming on. Don't forget to check out secretsun.blogspot.com, and of course his books are available at Amazon, and hopefully I can have you on again at some point in the future, and we can get into a little more in depth into parsing out the Star Wars story a little bit better and looking at some of the mystery religion angle. I'd really like to have you on as a guest again. I enjoyed speaking with you.
All right, it was great. Okay,
thanks a lot, Chris. I hope you have a really great night, and thanks for joining us here on The Stench of Truth.
The Stench of Truth, I love it.
That's what it's called, baby.
All right, thank you, and have a good night.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.